Hi everybody, Mr. Rogers here, back with my lecture series on the origins of the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution is one of the most complicated and contested issues of American history. Excuse me, of American history. So this is just a very brief and very quick overview that I've broken up into two videos. This first video, we're going to go over sort of the four big picture things that led to a crisis in the British empire that is going to lead to the American Revolution. Then in the second video, we're going to go over the four specific things that lead to the crisis that becomes the American Revolution. So again, trust me, if there's one subject I know a lot about, it's the origins of the American Revolution, and there's just so much that we could cover, but we've got to do it quick and dirty here and get as much into it as we can into this lecture series. So I'm going to break it again into those two parts, and this one covering the sort of biggest picture stuff that happened before 1763, and then we'll cover everything that happens between 1763 and 1765 that is just going to immediately create the what historians call the Imperial crisis that leads to the American Revolution. So let's jump right in then. So there are four key origins of the American Revolution, which was changes in the relationship between Britain and her colonies in the 1700s that helped lead to the American Revolution. These four key origins are the 7 Years' War, also known to some people as the French and Indian War, the Treaty of Paris of 1763. There's a lot of Treaty of Parises throughout world history. Paris is a great place to have a negotiation, apparently. But this one in specific is the one that happens in 1763, which, of course, we'll talk about in a few minutes, and Pontiac's War, and then British Imperial Reform. And those four this fourth one, British Imperial Reform, is what we'll be talking about specifically in the second half of this lecture. All right, so the first one, the 7 Years' War. What is the 7 Years' War? Also again known as the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War is the last in a series of imperial conflicts between the English and the French that ran throughout the 16 and 1700s. It began in 1754 when an expedition from Virginia led by George Washington, that guy right over here, accidentally murdered a French officer / diplomat. Yes, George Washington, who we'll be learning more about later, he is responsible for the 7 Years' War. His diplomatic screw-up blew up into a gigantic war that spread throughout the world. There was fighting in India, the Americas, Africa, and Europe. With British North America, which we've been learning about so far in this course, again, if you need any reminder about what British North America is and what it was like, look at my earlier series about colonial America. But British North America was an important battlefield in this war. In fact, George is involved in the very first major conflict in North America with the British. The 7 Years' War lasted from 1756 to 1763 and initially was a disaster for the British. The first major English force in America was ambushed and destroyed outside of modern-day Pittsburgh, another thing that involved George Washington. In the end, though, the British and their allies went out over France and its allies. In fact, the victory in North America is very definitive for the British when they capture New France, which is much of modern-day Canada. So, again, the war runs for about 7 years, and it is initially a disaster for the British. They lose their first major conflict in America outside of modern-day Pittsburgh when their leader, Edmund Braddock, is killed by the British and their Native American, the French and their Native American allies. But actually, in the end, the British and their allies end up triumphing over France and its allies. And the victory in North America, in particular, is very definitive for the British when the British seize control of New France, which is much of modern-day Canada. That's going to lead us into the second long-term big-picture cause of the American Revolution, which is the Treaty of Paris of 1763. So, the Treaty of Paris is the peace treaty that ends the war. It's the peace treaty that ends the war. In the Treaty of Paris, the French cede all of New France, modern-day Canada, to the British in exchange for captured Caribbean islands. You can look, Canada is a big honking place, and these Caribbean islands were really small, but the thing was, these Caribbean islands were worth more money to France than Canada was. The Spanish, which were a French ally, lose all of Florida, but gain New Orleans. And the French feel humiliated by the British with this peace treaty. But what's really important for our purposes is that the British Empire is now in control of everything east of the Mississippi River. So this is all Great Britain now. All of this in red here is Great Britain. And it's also important for our purposes because it's going to lead right into the next one of our 4 long-term causes of the French, or big picture causes of the American Revolution, is this peace treaty was a disaster for Indians east of the Mississippi River. They were no longer able to balance European powers against each other because a lot of Native American groups before the Treaty of Paris played the different European powers off against each other. They would do things to help out France. They would do things to help out Britain, whichever was more important to them at that moment. And the British and the French sought out Native American allies because they needed them to compete with one another. In the French and Indian War, in the 7 Years' War, there were some Native Americans on the British side, some Native Americans on the French side, and they were all willing to play the British and the French against each other for their own advantage. So Native American groups really lost out with this peace treaty. So in many ways, the big winner is Great Britain, which now controls all of the eastern North America, all of the eastern modern United States. The French are the big losers. They lose all of Canada. And of course, also Native Americans are big losers because they now lose the ability to play these two powerful European powers off against each other. And that brings us, of course, to the third cause of the American Revolution, third big picture cause of the American Revolution, which is Pontiac's War. So Pontiac's War emerged out of this new post-war political situation and a growing sense of unity among Native Americans. So many Native Americans felt that the outcome of the 7 Years' War was bad for them. They knew that, again, as I mentioned earlier, they were losing out of their ability to play the different European powers off against each other. And they also now had to deal with a united European settler group. They now only had to deal with the British. All the European settlers that all these different Native American groups were going to have to deal with were unified under the British government, and that put them in a bad situation. Unity among Europeans was bad for Native Americans. Now, that leads to critics of the Treaty of Paris to rally around a leader named Pontiac. And this sense of unity among different Native American groups who spoke a different language and sometimes practiced different religions was both, this sense of unity was new, and it was both spiritual and political. It went beyond any traditional group of groupings of Native Americans. It was preached by a prophet named Neolin, and Neolin argued that natives and Europeans were not born of the same stock. They were not the same species. Neolin was saying, look, Europeans are fundamentally different than us. We don't want anything to do with them. They were created separately from us. And Neolin and his allies encouraged natives to resist European culture, to resist European weapons, to resist European goods, to resist dealing with Europeans. And they especially disliked alcohol and land sales. They were afraid of the impact of alcohol on their community through addiction, and they were afraid of land sales getting rid of the land that Native Americans were living under. So Pontiac's War emerges out of a sense of unity among Native Americans that's growing, it's becoming stronger, and it's cutting across traditional groupings that separated Native Americans. It could be language, it could be political, and they're centering around this guy named Pontiac. That's where it comes from, Pontiac's War. He's the leader, or one of the leaders. And the war actually begins in 1763 when Native groups captured British forts around the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley. And Native efforts are actually really successful. They take a lot of British forts, and they raid Virginia, they raid Maryland, they raid Pennsylvania. And this creates huge terror among white colonists in these British colonies. They're afraid that they could lose to Pontiac. Because Pontiac and his forces, Pontiac and his allies are doing really well. They're taking British forts. But the problem is that Indians are unable to take the strongest British forts. They're unable. Native Americans are unable to take the strongest British positions. And that leads to Pontiac's War ending in a stalemate. A stalemate. The British are unable to defeat Native American unity, but the natives are unable to completely drive the British back to the sea. They're unable to take key positions that the British control. So by 1774, the pre-war status quo is restored, and fighting this war is expensive for the British, and they were concerned about having to fight another. So while Pontiac's War is unable for Native American groups to completely defeat the British and completely defeat European colonists, it is successful, and it scares the heck out of the British leadership. It's massively expensive for them to fight just to a stalemate. They are not able to make any gains against Pontiac and his forces. So, again, it's massively expensive. The British are really scared that they're going to have to spend all this money and have all these armies to prevent another war like Pontiac's War. So taking all three of these things that just happened, we have the 7 Years' War, we have the peace treaty that comes out of the 7 Years' War, and we have this Pontiac's War, which is really expensive, really exhausting for the British to fight. That brings us to this fourth thing, and the final thing we're going to talk about in this video, which is British Imperial reform. So we got King George III right over here, King George. All right, so after the 7 Years' War, the Treaty of Paris, Pontiac's War, the British Empire was an expensive, overextended, unorganized mess. The British had run up a massive debt fighting the French, and leaders wanted to put their newly expanded empire on secure military, political, and economic footing. The British were exhausted. They had spent all this money to fight the French, and then they spent more money to fight Pontiac. And it's just, Pontiac's War shows that they're going to just have new trouble. So yeah, they just won this awesome war. They're riding high. But Pontiac shows, well, my friends, things are not as good as you would hope. The British are in trouble. Their empire is an expensive, overextended, unorganized mess. And so that leads the British to, under leadership of this guy, Grenville, to come up with several fixes for their empire. Several things that they are going to do that they believe is going to fix their empire, put it on strong footing, prevent things like Pontiac's War from happening, prevent the French from coming back, and of course, most importantly, get that money that they need to keep their empire running. So, these are three things that they do. They want to strengthen a set of laws called the Navigation Acts. They issue what's called the Proclamation Line of 1763, and then they issued the Stamp Act. Now, all three of these reforms we're going to talk about in the second part of this video, and they're all geared towards trying to solve the problems that were highlighted by the Treaty of Paris, highlighted by the 7 Years' War, highlighted by Pontiac's War. They're all, the goal of these reforms is to try to put the British Empire on stable political, military, and economic footing to fix the problems that are emerging. So the British have this awesome new empire. They control all of Eastern North America. They've kicked the French out of North America. Things are looking good, but there are serious problems that they have to face, though, even though that they've won out. And that's what these three reforms are trying to address. So in the second video, we're going to go into what these three reforms are and some initial things about what the response to these reforms by the colonists themselves. But please check this video against your study questions. Please check out the second part of this video. And until then, stay safe and stay healthy.